It's a really big panel here. It's not going to be a classically moderated discussion, I think. And I don't think I'm going to read out all the intros I've done now in the last 2 days once more, but just to tell you, at least for those who weren't here yesterday, maybe just with the names, maybe on the far right from me. The Badiou translator, Alberto Toscano. We have Nina Power, we have Vanessa Thompson, we have Daniel Loic, we have Klaus Teveleit, we have Sayak Valencia, and Geoffroy is about to join us in a minute, I am told. So this is the very big and illustrious panel to close this symposium on violence. And I'd just like to start out with the general questions, and I would like to ask all of the participants of this panel to answer this individually, actually. Before, I maybe have other questions, and before we open this up, I would say about in 30 minutes from now, it's just a very general questions, because luckily, all of the participants, most of the participants actually been here for the whole time of the symposium, so they really know what we have talked about here, and I'd like to start out this panel with the questions. What got you thinking? When did you think, like in a sort of a pause, oh yes, this is interesting. This is something I have not thought about before. This is really provocative. This is really outstanding. This got me to think. Alberto, I'll start out with you because you have to leave the earliest.
You mean within the conference?
Oh yes. Not in your life. I didn't want to get that personal, but we could talk about that later. But.
This is a very sorry, I'm a little thrown, perhaps after the conclusion of the last debate. So, in terms of what got me thinking about the conference, maybe I was just thinking. I was quite struck by because partly she's not here, so maybe it's also good to talk about her paper about Victoria's talk, and in part I was struck also thinking about the other papers about what it means to the choice of recounting forms of violence or stories about violence, also the choice of showing images or not showing images. And partly I was struck by it, and maybe this had to do with some of the things that I was talking about in my talk, and we haven't really dealt with so much, about the fact that there's always seems to be a level of mimesis or fascination or even a very ambiguous identification that's almost always inevitable when discussing about issues around violence. And that was part of the reason why I was I was struck, and kind of naively struck, when I was reading some of this material about the Algerian War, about the fact that you had the same people engaging in what would be, to me, like totally principled, humanist, anti-colonial forms of solidarity, but also being, fascinated, with, literary and other accounts of violence. So I guess that kind of question is one that, especially because we are in a artistic stroke, intellectual stroke, cultural kind of space, and I've been in other conferences on violence where that was also the issue. What does it mean to constantly want to talk about it? And Vanessa brought it up as well in terms of not wanting to just simply repeat and engage in a kind of imitation of violence or make all forms of subaltern life or dominated life about the violence that people experience. So I guess it's more like a problem that I think maybe we haven't explored as much as we could, but it seemed to me to run across a lot of the different talks. So.
The problems of reiterating violence by talking about
of a kind
violence,
of mimesis and fascination, and that's one of the things I wanted to say. I think actually some of that fascination one should own and should also recognize that it might have like potentially emancipatory effects. That it's not, one shouldn't necessarily just be a kind of, so to speak, Puritan about it, saying, okay, well, if we talk about it again, we obviously repeat it. It's not so straightforward. And that unease and equivocity and ambivalence, I think, is part of these discussions, and I think it's interesting in terms of people's very different intellectual agendas and places that they come from, just to maybe think about that. But that's just...
Thank you, Alberto. Nina Power, please. What got you thinking?
Everything. Nothing. Especially nothing. I suppose one thing that we could push a bit more is maybe like the explanations of violence. I think it's very important, obviously Klaus Teweleit yesterday was speaking about kind of causal theory of violence to do with perhaps with like misogyny in the body and this kind of thing. And obviously we've had various forms of, description of violence, representation of violence, the question of the image and so on. And in a sense, the not wishing to disavow one's own violence, one's own feelings of aggression, psychoanalytically, philosophically, personally, physically, the kind of enmeshment in violence, the way in which we're, complicit in violence constantly. And I think... the question of exit is maybe one that's raised by the last paper in a certain sense. If the idea is that political theory, in a sense, is kind of, we can't escape from it in a certain way, we're trapped, and obviously, and that it's a monologue, that all political theory is proposing a particular idea of human nature and therefore of politics. And I think I mentioned Hobbes precisely because it was about giving an explanation for violence. The three causes of violence are, the seeking for glory, self-defense, and the other one, I don't know. Feelings of wanting to possess something that someone else has. And then I suppose, obviously I was trying to propose the idea of like a dialogue. But this, is important because precisely is at the moment where we disagree most violently, perhaps, with the people we disagree with the most. The people that we have already foreclosed and said, no, we can't speak to them. We cannot talk to the fascists. We can't talk to the neo-Nazi. We must no platform this person. This person believes the wrong thing. And to not recognize the violence of the position of weakness, the violence of the person who says, oh, I can't hear this thing. I can't listen to this thing. It would hurt me to do so. This is a very difficult moment. And we are in that moment in general. We're in that moment in academia. We're in that moment in public life. It's a very, very difficult question. And if we have that openly, if we say, look, where is the harm? Really, what harm are people feeling? What can we discuss? And in a sense, this puts me in a position of defending a certain notion of freedom of speech and freedom of association and freedom of thought, which in a sense is attempting, perhaps illegitimately, to occupy a kind of non-political, which is to say philosophical ground. It's almost like a, I don't know, a sort of Spinozist position in a certain way. But to try to hold open, if you like, not just a space for disagreement, but a space for the recognition of violence such that we can collectively talk about it and define it even, or get somewhere with a better place with an explanation for what violence is, and that we all share somehow.
Is that the philosopher in the attic talking now, or is it the activist talking too?
Well, my philosopher is in the garden talking to her friend.
Sorry.
But the mad uncle is in the attic sharpening his knives. But of course I will walk with my uncle, for sure. He's cool.
Vanessa Thompson.
Yeah, I think what stayed with me, what stayed with me also in terms of now the affect in this room, and just in reference also with the regarding the last presentation and the discussion around it, is again part of the question of decolonial solidarity, and on what kind of levels it fails within the process of trying to practice it, and how it is rather a question of failing better, not just to make it comfortable, but like rigorously, right? And how is decolonial solidarity when we talk about the space here in which we discuss violence, and simultaneously violently erasing so many modalities of violence, and what does that tell us about how we are inflicted in violence on various levels in terms of different positionings, but also how does the process of decolonial solidarity is actually one that needs to confront the question of what is made visible and what is violently erased at the same time, and how do we then come also to a form of politics that is rigid as a form of tough love, like knowing you will fail but trying to fail better. So I think it's because I am like, what stays with me is really like, where was violence produced through images, the narratives? Where was it not produced, but thereby also violently erased something? So knowing that there's no outside of violence.
Thank you, Vanessa. Danny, we have a big choice of microphones. Seize it.
Yeah, so the question was what got me thinking, and
Yes.
I think it's very easy to say for me because it's just watching the news, and the reason for me to write this talk was really the attempt to understand this, what I was talking about, the criminalization of the sea rescue. And I think this fact, this process, criminalizing sea rescue, is like so outrageous for me. Like, not only having the state not rescuing people in distress, not only having the state simply letting people drown, but actually the state hindering people who want to help others, right? And I mean, the deep outrageousness of this process, to understand, first of all, how this could happen, how this could develop, and also try to correct the fact that, I mean, I work in philosophy, in academic philosophy, and even in practical political philosophy, and I think the moral obscenity of this fact has not really been addressed, I think, even by people who are interested in morality and so on. So I think then what you do if you want to understand what's going on is you try to give a narrative, a social analysis, how this could happen, what logics or political rationalities contributed to, you know, this situation. And then, but also, and I think this is where it led me, where my analysis led me, was that it leads you not into easy solutions, but into ethical dilemmas or ethical aporias. And I think this is actually, interestingly, very similar to what all three of you already raised. The question of, first of all, like, what does it mean to give testimony? What does it mean to report cases of violence without reproducing it, without being part of the spectacle? You know, the spectacle of black suffering is something that's very much present in talking about what's going on in the Mediterranean, that the images you see are really, I think, yeah, I mean, you could just say, well, we have to report what's going on, but I mean, you do reproduce a certain form of pictorial violence, and so how can we talk about these things without reproducing? Is this one, and the other one is really the question of solidarity that you already mentioned, that because also very present in this whole debate about sea rescue is images of white saviors. And even in the German media, I think the narrative very often, when you discuss cases like the Sea-Watch or all these ships, you discuss the biographies or the motives of white people who you know, go on the ship to rescue people and so on. And how is it possible to break out of this active passive logic where, you know, you have one savior and one person being saved and so on, and how is it possible to build a solidarity that does not reproduce that? And I think I haven't come up with solutions for either of these two problems, but it's interesting that thinking does not lead you to solutions, but sometimes thinking leads you to dilemmas or to problems. And yeah, and I think that's also what happened with the last talk, that, you know, sometimes there's just no easy way out, and then maybe the right thing or the philosophical thing to do is to just stay in the wake, and try to understand these dilemmas that we are facing.
To face them, yes. Now, Klaus Teweleit, we know what made you angry by now, but I was asking more about what struck you as particularly inspiring or interesting in those 2 days you've attended the conference with us.
Yes, interesting. It's always to meet people and listen to them who are working in a similar direction as oneself is doing. And okay, what I learned from Mediterranean, Algerian war, and Mexican border, and Guatemala, and policing racist, it's all over the world in a way going on. So I can feel part of that, and for me especially. And I take the opportunity when I got this invitation by Susanne Pfeffer, and to stress this point, what I tried to do yesterday again, and when realizing this point of anti-femininity in the center of the American alt-right, these people, and I was astonished about that. I had thought that could have been historically evaded or gone,
Disposed with,
or
yeah.
in Breivik, and it's a point completely put aside in German public. And they don't write about the American involuntary celibatary man and so on.
The
In
incels.
Breivik it was the same. Yes, that this point of and why do they hate so much in gender? And gendering, they are gendered absolutely in every word they are doing, writing in the hierarchies and so on. So, and I tried to learn about it, to hear about it, what other people say about it. And one thing that appeared just the last days to me, that the point really is when they are hating women and femininity like that, that it may be just the point of equality. They can't accept not only women, children, and so on, other colors, other races as equal. They have to have this hierarchical world, and if that doesn't work, they go to the point of assassination and murder. Okay, there are things that are haunting me in a way, not every day and every second, but in everything I'm working on. And yes, so I was glad to be here.
Thank you. Now, Sayak, you criticized what you said was the position of privilege when talking about violence. Are there other things that struck you as evident or at the forefront of this discussion in the last 2 days that you probably didn't expect?
Well, actually, thank you for the invitation. I think it's a really important, really important meeting because we are sharing really different perspectives and positioning. And for me, it's not only the content or the continent, but the content of the form and the sense of the discourse. And I think it's here right now in Germany, and there over there in the border, we are sharing troubles. That it's really, really important about migrations and other stuff, but also for me it is really interesting to hear the whole person that just spoke here, because sometimes we can, obviously we can learn everything and research everything. So I just realized that the way the perception was changing historically about torture and politics and other stuff when you put it these images about the torture of how is the last name? Bupasha. And I was like, that was a really strong images right there in that time and that moment, and it makes a lot of sense for many people. And then that is, right now we can see it like art and kind of naive, but it's a really strong image for that time, and the way the violence is just ascending and normalized in our context. It's like showing off all the time violence, the way we just making interactions with other people all the time that are maybe not here, but it's a kind of really violent. Actually, the way we interact, that I was interacting with Geoffroy, was a kind of a good example and performatic example about how the violence works, and in the both ways. Like we are thinking about violence, but we can, and even we are in the same team about criticizing the violence and whatever, but also we have this hierarchy about the power of the knowledge, the power of the being, and the power of the coloniality of being, the coloniality of the knowledge epistemologically, and also the coloniality of the power, and who have the power to be questioned or not questioned. And for me, it's really interesting about how we can not just make the mocking about this formula about decolonization, like women and decolonization and blackness, and how you he was like a mocking about it. It's not for mocking. It's about to put it really complexity, the conversation about violence, and for me, it's really interesting that we are making this effort to rationalize violence, but also we are making other stuff with affects and emotions and other kind of solidarities that just unleash or making other kinds of communities of care and solidarity. And I just want to say thank you to the persons in the public that just came to me and said, I want to say that, but I can't because I just don't. And I said, oh, okay, it's not just a way of perception of myself, it's a way of how the structure of the rationality is made it. So it's really interesting, and I think it's a point for making more further conversations and complex conversations about not just violence, but what it means in the daily life violence. And I feel I really appreciate the whole effort that you made for making this symposium, and the kindness that the people who was here and sharing and everything. And for me, it's like if you are in Germany right now, there is a lot of borders here too, and that's why we have to keep in touch and talking about the borders, and not just physically, but also racial, class, and these things that are just become sometimes like empty concepts for the academia, but we are not empty concepts. We are persons, we are flesh, we are locations, countries, whatever, you know. It's not just about to reflect it, but to make actions with this reflection. And for you and for us, as the fascism is arising again, and the colonialism never go out of our countries, we have this intersection really important. If you want to know, maybe it's a suggestion, but if you want to know how the racial persons go through all the time, and you don't know what it means, the coloniality in everyday life, you don't just thinking about fascism here and how it acts. And it's a different display of violence, but in the same is the same root about making people violently governed with violence. And it's I can explain it really good and really clear because I'm speaking in English, so I'm making karaoke of myself. But it's really important to have this discussion right now, because we have to act against this kind of violence. It's all the time happening in the everyday life, like policing, racialized, or the representation of violence. But we are here because we want to change things. I think so. I'm here not just because I want to make a new book or have a new performance. I am here because I want to make this really violent context and world a different place. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So also thank you to the organizers of this whole conference, I think. Yeah. Time's running. I do have one more question, but I wonder, it's 4:30. Should we open it up to the public already, or shall we? No, nochmal eine Runde, ne? Okay, one more round. Let me go back to the beginning, so to speak. I know this is very general again, but we're a big panel here. Let me just start on a very general term. In the introductory text to the symposium, in the announcement, so to speak, the curators say violence we are currently experiencing. They speak of an increase of violence And that is not my point. My point is that they say it has led to a new public. I think we are part somehow of this new public, or at least of a public, to discuss that increase of permeating violence. I know it is not specifically, it's not geographically specified, it's not racially or socially specified, it's not gendered, that's what I mean with the general term. But do you think actually those discourses we are sort of making or doing in those 2 days actually do lead to new forms of public, and can you identify those new forms of public that strike you, say, in the last 10 years? We don't have to go one by one, just whoever thinks would like to answer. Alberto, I know you're you didn't. You have to let it sink in a little bit. Well, I think since we are part of that public, it might be interesting just to spend a couple of minutes on the nature or on the nature of those publics. Are there new publics for those kind of questions actually? Do you see an increase there?
I mean, on the definition of the public, I mean, there's a very famous line from Robert Peel, who's the founder of the police in the UK, who says, like, the police are the public and the public are the police. You know, and there's a certain sense in which the public is deeply connected to the police in a certain way, and to the polis. You know, this idea of the public, it's not a right or left-wing term, actually. It's a very, very manipulable term. If we're speaking about something like public opinion, you know, you can manipulate, you can create public opinion, you can, you know, I mean, it's sort of too vague a question in a certain way, no offense, but it's a very journalistic sort of question. I think, you know, when we're talking about kind of groups and collectives and communities and states, I mean, there is a sense in which, you know, we might need to sort of have a kind of like etymological, historical, political precision in a certain way. I mean, certainly there's been lots of artworks that have tried to engage with the question of the public, and, you know, in England and Wales, the law that deals with public demonstrations is precisely the public order law, you know, and there's a serious question about the way in which the state actually presupposes public disorder at all times. You know, that the state's fundamental assumption is that there is disorder and that people are unruly and the public is unruly, and that when they get too out of order, like, so for example, when they block the roads, and blocking the roads is about blocking the passage of the sovereign, or about blocking the highway, basically. Ultimately, it's a very old-fashioned question. It's like, can the king or queen get to where they want to go? You know, it's true. I mean, England is basically very feudal, but, you know, it's a good place to look at in this way. You know, so basically you punish people, you punish the public in the name of another public, right? So the public of the public order law, right, is a ghost, you know, it's made up. Like, so we were talking about, well, what is the state? Well, it's a bunch of people. Yeah, sure, let's not forget that. But it's very ossified. So, but public order is like, you get this image of the public, so the public that want peace and quiet, the Queen's peace, as it's called, in fact. So not only the peace for the Queen, but the peace as determined by the sovereign. And then you punish actual individuals or groups in the name of this public, right? So there's a public of the actual public who's protesting, and then there's the public of the public order law in whose name they're being punished. So the state doesn't say, we're going to punish you directly. The sovereign doesn't say, right, I'm going to cut off your head or whatnot. So, I mean, it's a very complicated question.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to talk about the police, really. I just meant to make it more concrete. I just thought, are there, like, do you get a wider audience with your work, what you do? Is there more public awareness? Is there more mainstream coverage about the work you do, about the subjects you address? And I think that is implied in that announcement, in that introductory text. And this is what I wanted to ask. Do you think there's more awareness for what you do, in other words? That's what I meant. Is there quasi a new kind of public, or a public that recognizes or acknowledges more about the subjects we've talked about in the last 2 days? That was the pretty simple question I wanted to ask, and not address the idea of the public in philosophical terms.
Yeah, I think, it's maybe important here to think of the public more in an intersectional sense, and who can appear in the public, and what kind of course, the issue of racial profiling, for example, if I now refer to what I my paper was on, then there is a discussion of it, but at the same time it's disqualified. So it's also the question like, what kind of public is engaging with the topic, in which kind of way, and who is then able to even appear in the public. So I think, because you said it's maybe not just a question of all these oppressed social relations and social categories, I think it is. Because who can appear in the public and even become, and can enter the realm of the public and be recognized as a subject of the public, a political subject, differs very tremendously, right? And I think the other question is, when I talked about the notion of fugitivity, I'm troubleshooting myself with this, but I am thinking if the notion of the public, being visible in the public, is the question. Like when I think about post-colonial movements, anti-racist movements, it was a long time about like visibility, right? But now with the differential logics of diversity, inclusion, etc. I really think, how can we withdraw from visibility? Not completely, but I think like the underground, the fugitive notion is also something we have to think about more and interrogate more in terms of the question of the public. And then the third point, briefly, I know you wanted to, but I feel the pressure. No, I don't feel the pressure. I want to respond to the question of Eurocentrism. Because I find it really important, of course, to raise it, and I try to refer to that in terms of, like, we're speaking about violence, and what is the violence, for example, we erase. I mean, we all know that two nuclear powers are India and Pakistan at the moment, like, and what's the situation with Kashmir, one of the militarized regions in this world, and for me as a person who also looks at policing, criminalization, etc., that's crucial. And at the same time, it's very so we have to think about how to make maybe these symposiums more horizontal in a radical way, not via the logic of including certain perspectives and then saying, okay, we don't have to talk about this because this person presents this perspective and this person presents this perspective. Because I am for accounting lived experiences, but I also think, referring here to Yayana Khan, like, how can we depart in terms of our politics from a place that is not only defined by our identities? And that also in terms of challenging Eurocentrism, to not just make it an inclusive logics, because it's also not that easy to say, okay, now we're just going to invite a person who speaks then on the Kashmir conflict, because at the same time, very often in this discourse, then local critiques are, for example, disqualified, right, or neglected, invisibilized. So it's a very, very slippery slope. Yeah, those were the 3 things.
I would like to come back and for a moment to this point of policing again, which went through my head, yes, the last hours. And what you described, absolutely clear and evident, racial profiling and so on. I realize it when going from Freiburg, where we are living, often to Switzerland, and the border police coming through the train, the custom people coming, whom are they controlling? Only people who are looking foreign. And everybody who sits there, show the passport, open your bags, and so on. Me is not controlled for years now. 50 years ago, 40 years ago, in the 70s, when we crossed the border to France, we were controlled as long-haired people all the time because of drugs, cigarettes, alcoholics, weapons, possibly in the car. That point is over. But this policing, and I want to add that to that what you told, is far more, and the case for nearly everyone, possibly at every place. some years ago, and I've been teaching, and my wife and me have been in Charlottesville for a term for 4 months, and one of our white friends there told us he was taken 2 times out of his car by police with gun at his head. He had done nothing. And he was still living, so he came out of that situation. But he said that can happen to you all the time. Not only black people we know are more shot in the US than white ones, but them too. 70% in the jails are black, are colored in a way, not white people. But he said the police is half-half. Half of them are criminals or fascists. The other half maybe is okay. It's good luck if you meet this one or that one. And so this departure of, that means it can happen to you every time, every moment. If you get to one of those half of criminals, he called the US police. Don't know how the percentage is here. We have G20 and things like that. There are criminal people on the side of the demonstrators and criminal people on the police side, obviously. In Hamburg, Bürgermeister and so on, no, the police was okay. They was right. They get this shelter for everything what they are doing till now. And I really don't know how to get, how to lower this or to lower this possibility of police violence. Always have in mind the ending of the Chandler novel, The Big Sleep, where the last sentence are about the persons of the novel. I never met any of them again, except for the police. No way has invented yet to get rid of them.
Please, Zayak, and then we probably open it to the public, I would say.
Okay.
Looking at the time,
I just want to make, I don't know if it's there is a new public, but I think it's an intergenerational publics, and that is really important for me because the voices we are sharing here are from different generations, but also the people who is coming to share with us and listen us, but also share some stuff with us are younger. So for me, it's really important to open the conversation and the public and the new publics. I don't know if it is new, but the intergenerational stuff is really important because the people who are before us, they have this memory about all the time, but the other time, but the world was a comprehensive, was different, shaped differently, and it's like a passing information through the generations. It's really important to maintain the memory, construct this relation, but not only rational relation, but a body relation and emotional relation and resistant relation, and also exchange strategies of resistance from their generations to the our generations, and the younger generation have their own struggles and also own strategies. And I think we have to learn a lot of the young people, a lot, from kids to 20s or the teenagers right now, because they are making this exactly good reading of the world and the context, because they are just born in this context, and it changed a lot for many of us. I'm born in the 80s, and then I just saw yesterday told about, I really have this really clear memory about when the Berlin walls just fall. And it was really interesting for me as a kid that have the perception that everything can change in a day. It was like something that's really, really symbolic, but also material. And it changed a lot of my perception, and that it was a historical change, but also give me the possibility to know that the history matters, and we construct it all the time. So for me, the idea of the new public is more like the public is there, we have to occupy it with this intergenerational conversation for make some resistant strategies and make new conceptualizations of violence, because the actualization of the violence is really fast. So for me, it's really important to just think with the classics, like in philosophy, but also with new forms of thinking violence, this from art, from activism, from everyday life. So thank you very much for this question, and yeah.
Thank you.